So, welcome everyone to Crown Point State Historic Site. Thanks for coming. My name is Sam Huntington. I'm the Historic Site Manager here at Crown Point. This presentation today, Robert Rogers and the Revolutionary War by Martin Klotz, falls in the first year of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. At Crown Point in 1775, 250 years ago, actually tomorrow on June 15th, 1775, it was shortly, about a month after the capture of Crown Point by the revolutionaries, Seth Warner's regiment of Green Mountain Boys. A month later, there were Continental soldiers here under Benedict Arnold's command. On June 15th, tomorrow, they signed a Declaration of Principles, kind of a precursor to the American Declaration of Independence that would come about a year later. We actually have a copy, a reproduced copy over there on the table. We're in the midst of this 250th anniversary season. This program is part of that 250th commemoration, but I should also say that it's part of a resurgent Friends group here at Crown Point. In a minute, I'll introduce Rob Sanasardo, the president of the Friends group here at the site. It's really, this is their event, really the first big event or first significant event that the Friends have done in quite some time. And I just want to thank all of them, thank all of you for coming, but also just a special statement of gratitude to the Friends group for all their hard work and bringing this organization kind of forward and really looking forward into this 250th anniversary year in celebration. So with that, I'll introduce Rob. Rob Sanasardo is the new president of our Friends organization. He took over last fall with and welcomed kind of a new group of members, new board members, and has been doing really just a fantastic job leading the organization into its next chapter. So I'll turn it over to Rob, who will introduce Martin, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your support, not only for the Crown Point Historic Site, but also for the Friends group. I am completely honored to introduce our guest honoree today. He's a little background information. He's a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, serving as a federal prosecutor, then in private practice, represented investment professionals in criminal and regulatory investigations of securities trading. His book, Robert Rogers Ranger, The Rise and Fall of American Icon, is a must-read for all history lovers. Again, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Martin Klotz.
And my background, as you may have picked up, has absolutely nothing to do with the book, and gives me no qualifications whatsoever for writing it. It's a project that was a retirement project, which I was delighted to do. I'm talking about Robert Rogers and the American Revolution because it's the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Rogers is famous for his role in the French and Indian War. The American Revolution, which comes at the tail end of my book and the tail end of Rogers' professional career, was really a low point in his career and not a particularly inspiring story. But it's an interesting story for a whole host of reasons in its own right, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I get to Rogers in the American Revolution, let me refresh everybody's recollection about Rogers, the hero of the French and Indian War. By late 1760, Rogers was the #1 colonial military hero in the French and Indian War, and he was probably one of the 2 or 3 best-known Americans in the entire world at the time. Far better known than George Washington, who played a relatively minor role in the French and Indian War, probably on the par with Benjamin Franklin, who was known in Europe, but he was an extremely famous person. And 2 of the exploits that led to his high reputation have a connection to Crown Point. He first established himself as a really enterprising and valuable scout in 1755 after Sir William Johnson defeated the French at the Battle of Lake George. Johnson was then hard pressed for real information about the French numbers of military personnel, where they were stationed, what their plans were. And one of the great difficulties he had was that nobody in the colonial forces had the slightest interest in scouting in Indian territory. They were terrified of going into territory that they knew nothing about and didn't control. Johnson repeatedly complained that people would simply refuse to go on scouts if they were asked. If they did go on scouts, they would find excuses very quickly to come back without getting any valuable information. And Rogers' commanding officer proposed Rogers to do some scouting for William Johnson. And the first scout that he did was to Crown Point, the French fort at St. Frederick, at Crown Point, where he, in the course of an expedition, got all the way at night to the walls of Crown Point, fell back to a high point behind the Fort St. Frederick and used it to sketch, do a detailed sketch of the fort, counted the number of troops and the number of different units there, and got back to Sir William Johnson with the first really reliable information that Johnson got during the course of the French and Indian War, and he became a favorite of Sir William Johnson and his preferred scout, and that really launched his career. The signature campaign of Rogers' career, which was his attack on the Abenaki Indian town of St. Francis, which took place in 1759, started from Crown Point. And it would have come back to Crown Point if it had been had gone as planned. It went badly awry, and Rogers wound up retreating to Fort Number 4, a different location 100 miles away, and in the process lost 50 men of the 140 he had with him to starvation, which led to cannibalism, to Indian and French attacks. The retreat was a complete catastrophe. But Rogers largely fabricated a report of the actual battle at St. Francis, in which he reported that he killed 200 Abenaki warriors, which would have completely destroyed the Abenaki Indians as a fighting force. And they had been the plague of the northern colonies for decades. And Rogers made sure that this report got to the press as quickly as possible. And the press was just bowled over by what an incredible outcome this was. And he had already been famous with the press, but this really cemented his position as a public figure and the greatest military hero of the French and Indian War, based, as I said, on false information that only became rectified much, much later as people figured out what really happened. Rogers' military peers regarded him as pompous and self-serving and not nearly as effective as he claimed to be. But he was an absolute darling of the press, which he was extremely successful in working with, and that led to his reputation in 1760. Before I go to the next slide, you'll see this portrait of Robert Rogers repeatedly in the presentation here, and I tell everybody this portrait bears absolutely no relationship to what Robert Rogers actually looked like. It was done by an illustrator in London in 1775 or 1776 on commission to a bookseller in London who thought it would be a terrific idea to do a series of portraits of patriot leaders in the campaign for independence against Great Britain. And first of all, the illustrator and the bookseller were apparently under the misapprehension that Rogers was fighting or planning to fight on the Patriot side. He became a confirmed loyalist and was not at all a Patriot leader. But more importantly, the person who did the illustration had never laid eyes on Rogers and had no descriptions of what Rogers looked like. And in fact, there is no portrait from life of Robert Rogers. All of the verbal descriptions of Rogers, however, emphasized that he was extremely large, extremely athletic. One report calls him a giant, and a very physically imposing person, which this portrait, for me at any rate, does not have those connotations. But the illustrator, sort of generally knew about his background, knew that he was an Indian fighter, so you see an Indian in the background, knew that he, used a flintlock rifle, so you see him carrying that. But that's the history of the portrait of Rogers. Sam, next slide, if I could have it. After the war, like an awful lot of military heroes, Rogers was almost completely at loose ends. He got sent on one mission that he appreciated to the western French forts to let the French garrisons in the far reaches of the frontier know that France had surrendered in the east and the war was in effect over. This was 1760. The war wasn't really concluded until peace was signed in 1763, but the fighting in the colonies stopped in 1760. So that was one assignment, but when he got back, he was posted to South Carolina to recruit troops for further campaign work in the Caribbean. He hated South Carolina. He contracted malaria. He was constantly complaining that he wanted to get brought back to the north. Amherst, his commanding officer, eventually allowed him to do that and sent him on a campaign that he thought might have some interest to him, which was going back to Detroit in the middle of Pontiac's War, which was an Indian uprising. But Rogers went there in a subordinate role and didn't really play a major role and was only there for a couple of months. And when he got back to the east, his command had been decommissioned and he was furloughed from the British Army. So in 1763 and 1764, he was no longer an active duty officer and struggling to figure out a way to make a living, and not very successful at it. He contracted absolutely astronomical debts, totaling in today's money something like $3 million on a retired captain's salary. Rogers was basically a person who, no matter how much money they had, spent more than it. And he actually seemed to enjoy jousting with creditors and cadging subordinates for loans that he never repaid. And he seems to have treated money as a game. And the debts that he contracted appear to have been largely gambling debts, money spent on luxury items for himself and his wife, and a few bad business investments thrown into the pot, but they left him financially crippled. And in 1764, he was arrested for debt and imprisoned, and he engineered a jailbreak. He was arrested in New York, in which a Confederate gave him a horse and some money, and he galloped away from New York to Connecticut, but that made him a fugitive from justice in New York with a bounty on his head. And that was not a great position to be in for staying in the colonies. So at that point, Rogers decamped to England. He spent 1765 in London, where he was incredibly successful in persuading the king, the king's ministers, and a lot of highly placed aristocrats in London that he was A, a brilliant military leader, and B, that his indebtedness was because he had spent his entire personal fortune and gone into debt in order to equip and arm his ranger force, which he told everyone he raised at his own expense. That was a complete fabrication. He advanced virtually no money on behalf of the Rangers. The debts were debts that did him no credit at all. Certainly the people who knew him in the colonies attributed them all to extravagance and gambling debts. But nobody in London had any first-hand knowledge, and they took his word for it, and the king in particular was extremely moved that one of his subjects would be reduced to personal ruin because he was so loyal to the king. And the king ordered his claims against the British Army re-examined. It turned out the re-examination led to it getting nothing. but more importantly, appointed him as commander to the most remote post on the frontier, Fort Michilimackinac, which is in the Mackinac Straits between Lower Michigan and Upper Michigan, very close to Mackinac Island, and eventually the fort was actually relocated to Mackinac Island, but not during Rogers' tenure. This was, on the one hand, the furthest post away from the centers of population in the colonies, but on the other hand, a trading center at the center of a vast territory on the frontier of the colonies, and it provided Rogers with a terrific opportunity to redeem himself, but he essentially squandered it. He quarreled repeatedly with his military commander, Thomas Gage, and with the Indian Affairs head, Sir William Johnson, who had been one of his original supporters but turned into one of his worst enemies. He spent money in direct defiance of orders. He tried to lobby London to create a new province in the colonies that would be the largest province of any of the colonies under Rogers' personal governorship. That project fell through, but he basically made enemies right and left in the colonies. And it all culminated with his arrest for treason, based on a letter that was intercepted on its way to Rogers from a from a former British officer who had defected to the French, who wrote to Rogers saying, we've had multiple conversations in the past. I want to follow up on what we've talked about. You would really do better doing what I did, which is defect to the French. While you're thinking it over, make friends with the Indians in the Michilimackinac area, and be prepared at the right time to join the French cause. I think that's where you belong. There's no evidence that Rogers specifically did anything to further that enterprise, although a lot of what he did in Michilimackinac could be interpreted as part of what this, Hopkins was the name of the defector who was now working for the French, what the Hopkins letter suggested. But the main thing Rogers did was he didn't tell anybody about the letter, which fell into the hands of Thomas Gage and Sir William Johnson. And they regarded this as mightily suspicious. And when one of Rogers' employees turned against him and told everybody about the letter and Rogers' plan to defect, he was arrested for treason. The prosecution of the treason trial essentially was botched, and Rogers wound up being acquitted, which he took as an exoneration. But it really was not an exoneration, because in the course of the trial, it became clear that he absolutely refused to work for any superiors in the British Army, and that after he was arrested for treason, he conspired with Native Americans in the Michilimackinac area to kidnap the British officers who were his fellow British officers and use them as ransom to get Rogers released. And after his release, it's clear that he planned to flee to New Orleans, which was at that point a French bastion. This wasn't properly charged in the treason count. The evidence was botched. Rogers was acquitted, but the king, in affirming the acquittal, which a king has to do for a court-martial of a British officer, said, even though he was acquitted, and I affirm that acquittal, there certainly was substantial evidence to support the charges. So in effect, Rogers had his reputation completely ruined as a result of that. He returned in 1770 to London, and I'll quickly run through that. He was trying to do what he had done successfully in 1765, which was persuade powerful proponents to get him a new appointment, something that would allow him to make a large amount of money or give him a responsible command. It all fell through. His inability to live within his income haunted him repeatedly, so he spent about half the time in London in debtor's prison there. This is a great portrait from, I can't remember who, of what debtor's prison in London looked like. He only managed to get out of debtor's prison in late 1774, when England passed the first of the real modern bankruptcy laws, that allowed Rogers to erase his debts by pledging what little property he had left to the state, and that allowed him to be released. He hung around London for another 6 months, again lobbying for an appointment which never came through, and then he returned to America, leaving England in, I think, May of 1775, and arriving in August of 1775 in Baltimore, from where he made his way to Philadelphia. The Rogers who came to America in 1775 was very different, was very different from the Rogers who was a hero of the colonial press and colonial public in 1760. He was financially ruined. He hadn't done anything of any importance for the last 15 years. He'd been away from all of the political and economic centers of the colonies, so he'd lost touch with powerful patrons in the colonies. And he really had nothing to recommend him to anybody. He still was a public figure from the French and Indian War, but that was increasingly in the past and increasingly unrelated to anything of political importance in 1775. So Rogers returns to America, and I'll get the next slide, please. He returns to America in the fall of 1775. He is arrested because he's a British officer, albeit in retirement, and the Continental Congress didn't trust him. But the Continental Congress released him on a pledge that he would not support the British or Loyalist cause, or provide information to the British or Loyalists about what the Continental Congress was doing, or the Patriot forces generally. While he was in Philadelphia, and after he got released on this pledge of not supporting the opponents of the Patriot cause, he approached Samuel and John Adams with offers to serve in the Continental Army, and told the Adams cousins, things are going to get hot in the spring. I'm your man when that time comes. You know where to reach me. I'm happy to be signed up if you need me. So that makes it look as if he was someone with pro-patriot sympathies, but at the same time, he was affirming his loyalist sympathies to everybody in power on the British and Loyalist side. And in particular, after he was released in Philadelphia, he traveled to New York, where he approached the British-appointed Governor Tryon with a proposal that he be awarded land grants in the colonies as compensation for his services during the French and Indian War. Tryon was clearly a loyalist without the slightest sympathy for the Patriot cause, and Rogers either knew or should have known that his constant communication with Tryon was going to be viewed with great suspicion by the Patriots in the colonies, but he nonetheless spent an enormous amount of time in Tryon's company, and during that period of time affirmed to Tryon, to his former antagonist Thomas Gage, to various other high-ranking British people, his complete commitment to the Loyalist cause. And he wrote a friend in London that in his view the Patriots were laboring under an unhappy delusion in resisting British authority. So the real question is, what were Rogers' sympathies during 75 and early 76, his first year in the colonies? Was he really a pro-patriot who was saying what he thought he needed to say to the British to keep them off his back? Was he really a pro-loyalist saying what he thought he needed to say to the Patriots to keep them off his back? Or was he genuinely ambivalent about how political developments were going? And that's the key question for understanding what happened over the next period of time. He has his conversations with Tryon, his first round of conversations with Tryon in September of 1775. And after that, he completely or almost completely disappears from the public record for about a period of a month and a half or 2 months, and nobody really has any idea what he's doing. He was traveling extensively through the northern colonies for no apparent purpose, and his explanations of why he was doing it are sort of, maybe that's plausible, but they don't make a whole lot of sense. he showed up at an odd location, which was Dartmouth College, which had already been founded back then, where he shabbily dressed, according to the president of Dartmouth College, stopped at a nearby tavern for refreshment, and then came to meet the president of Dartmouth College with an implausible story of how he was there because he wanted to volunteer his services as a fundraiser for Dartmouth College. What made the appearance there really odd was that Hanover, New Hampshire was way to the north of anywhere Rogers had any reason to go because he had family connections or business interests, but it was on the way to or from Montreal, which was a loyalist stronghold, which the Americans were attempting to, defeat unsuccessfully. And this appearance at Dartmouth caused rumors that what Rogers really was up to was going back and forth to Montreal to establish connections with the loyalist forces there. Nobody really knows what's true because there's really no record of where he was. From Dartmouth, he goes to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he does have reason to be. That's where his wife lived, and he hadn't seen his wife for more than 5 years at this point, and it's clear that she had had enough of him, but he did stop in for a day or two to say hello to her and to her child, who was his son, but only for a day or two. And then he goes on from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to Boston, where Washington is in the process of besieging the British troops under General Howe in Boston. Rogers seeks an appointment with Washington, but Washington thinks he's a spy, and Washington refuses to see him because he thinks Rogers is only interested in prying information about Continental Army dispositions and plans for the future and things of that sort. So Washington won't see him, but Washington has two of his general officers interview Rogers about what he's been up to, and both of the people who interview him can't find anything to conclusively put him in the loyalist camp, but both of them conclude that his explanation of what he's doing and where he's been, while you can't disprove it, seems sort of funny, and they both suspect him of loyalist sympathies, but nobody really knows. After those interviews, Rogers returns to New York. Then, next slide, what he does in New York. He returns to New York and gets back in touch with Governor Tryon, supposedly lobbying for these land grants, which are going to do him a lot of good in reestablishing his solvency. But Tryon at this point is almost a prisoner. He's fled the land in New York and is holed up in a British warship in the New York harbor. And he is attempting to govern the state of New York from this British warship when New York City is in fact completely in Patriot hands. And the Patriots in New York get increasingly agitated about people visiting Tryon on his ship and conducting business with him as if he's really the governor of New York. Well, Rogers is one of those people, and he makes repeated visits to Tryon, supposedly in service of trying to establish land grants, but nobody really knows. And the Patriots in New York get increasingly frustrated with Rogers. They have already put into effect rules that no one is permitted to visit Governor Tryon. When those rules get put in effect, Rogers petitions for an exception for himself, claiming that he should be permitted to go back and forth because he has important personal business not related to the hostilities between the two parties. Nobody on the Patriot side believes it, and they get so angry with Rogers for insisting on continuing to see Tryon that they expel him from New York and tell him never to come back. In fact, what Tryon is up to at the time is he is attempting to organize a loyalist revolt that will retake New York. that ultimately turns into a conspiracy to assassinate George Washington and several other leading Continental Army figures. Washington, after Howe evacuates Boston, which I think was March 1775, Washington returns to New York with the Continental Army and is established in New York, and Tryon, from his warship, is at the heart of a conspiracy to undermine Washington in particular and the Patriot cause in general. And again, for a period of 2 months, Rogers almost completely disappears, and one has no idea what he's up to, whether he's still in communication with the Loyalist side or not. He does make an appearance again in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for a final visit with his wife, which was a complete disaster. And he solicits letters of recommendation from a couple of prominent New Hampshire patriots supporting the idea that he would make a great officer for the Continental Army. And Rogers promises to deliver those letters personally to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Why would he do that? He had already established contact with the Adams cousins. He had no real, everybody knew who he was. And I think that the reason he solicited these letters is if he were ever stopped and questioned by Patriot forces, what are you up to? He could produce these letters and say, this is proof positive that I'm really on the Patriot side. And I think they were a front, but nobody can ever really tell what happened. In any event, and now we get to the next slide, the Tryon conspiracy against Washington and the other Continental Army officers is betrayed by someone in June of 1775, and a whole host of people are arrested. It includes a member of Washington's personal guard who was intended to be the person to assassinate Washington. But more importantly, from Rogers' point of view, one of the first people arrested was a very close associate of Rogers, who Rogers had used in the past as an intermediary in his discussions with Governor Tryon. So the Patriot forces, once the conspiracy was unmasked, suspected that Rogers was a part of it. Tryon destroyed all of his personal records from this period of time, although his records from most of he was a colonial administrator for a period of like 15 years, and kept meticulous records, but for this period of time they're destroyed, almost certainly intentionally to cover up who was actually a member of the conspiracy and who wasn't. So we don't really know what Rogers was up to and whether he was a member of this conspiracy. But Washington is sufficiently suspicious that he orders Rogers arrested and brought to New York to be interrogated by Washington personally. Rogers is arrested in South Amboy, New Jersey, which geographically is on the south side of Staten Island, and a very long hike, sail, or whatever to New York City. But it happens to be the exact location where General Howe was expected to land with his troops that had evacuated Boston and are now going to go someplace else in the colonies. And at the time he was arrested, Rogers had been there for 2 to 3 weeks. So Washington says, well, Mr. Rogers, what were you doing hanging around in South Amboy? And Rogers pulls out his letters from these supporters in New Hampshire and says, I was on my way to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to volunteer to serve in the Continental Army. And Rogers says, and Washington says, well, but you stayed in South Amboy for 2 or 3 weeks. And Rogers says, oh, that's because I had property that was still in New York and somebody who owed me money, and I was waiting for them to pay me the money and give me my property back. And Washington says, well, you were a long way from, New York City. If that's what you were up to, why not just hang out in Jersey City, which was a lot closer? And Rogers doesn't have any explanation for that. Washington is not satisfied, and he sends Rogers under guard to Philadelphia to the Continental Congress. Rogers succeeds in escaping from Philadelphia, shortly after the Declaration of Independence is passed on July 4th. And he then makes his way to Staten Island, where General Howe has in fact landed, just as expected, only days after Rogers' arrest. And he makes his way to General Howe's camp and offers his services to the British cause, and Howe commissions him to raise a loyalist battalion of Queen's Rangers that will fight on the British side for the duration of the Revolutionary War. So the question is, during this whole period of time, what was Rogers' real allegiance? And on the one hand, nobody really knows, and at this point there's no evidence that conclusively proves it one way or another. Some of his friends from the time, and a number of historians, say that he really was patriotic in his sympathies, that there really was no basis for Washington to arrest him, but his arrest forced his hand because he obviously couldn't serve the Continental Army with Washington having this dim view of him and had no alternative but to offer his services to the British. Personally, I think that's far too generous to Rogers. I think he was a confirmed loyalist from the day he set foot in America, that he likely was operating as a spy for the British, likely was a member of the Tryon conspiracy, but there's no conclusive way of knowing whether that's true or not. In any event, Rogers starts raising his force of Queen's Rangers. Howe moves to Brooklyn in August of 1775. Rogers still doesn't have his regiment completely together. He moves to Brooklyn as well to continue recruiting. Howe inflicts a devastating defeat on the Continental Army in the battle of, variously known as the Battle of Brooklyn, the Battle of Long Island, in late August of 1776. Rogers does not participate in that battle, but after the battle, Rogers and his Queen's Rangers are posted to northern Long Island, opposite Connecticut, with two jobs. One is to continue recruiting, and the second is to screen people coming and going between Connecticut and Long Island to see if they're interested in serving with the Loyalists, and otherwise to sort of interrogate them about the sympathies of residents of Connecticut. One of the people who comes across during this period of time is Nathan Hale. And Rogers, for whatever reason, grows suspicious of Nathan Hale and decides to trick him. He finds Nathan Hale having dinner in a tavern one night, and Rogers, with no introduction, stands him a drink and engages him in conversation, and they sit around the tavern drinking during the course of the evening. And after they get, comfortable with each other and, friendly and everything like that, Rogers says to Nathan Hale, I have to tell you, I'm really uncomfortable being here on Long Island because these people are half of them Loyalists. And my sympathies personally are with the Continental Congress and the Continental Army. And Hale registers, that's pretty interesting, because I'm here, as a spy for the Continental Army. And later in the conversation, Rogers says, you can't tell this to anybody, but between you and me, I'm actually here at General Washington's urging to find out what the British are up to and where they're intending to go next. And Hale says, no kidding, me too. And Rogers says, completely dead man, I tell you what, come back here tomorrow and I'll introduce you to a bunch of like-minded people and we can all work together. And Hale says, you got a deal. And he shows up and he gets arrested and he's executed the next day. So that was Rogers' major achievement as a loyalist during the Revolutionary War. Interestingly enough, this story only came out something like 20 years ago when a Revolutionary War era resident, either Long Island or Connecticut, I'm not sure, wrote a personal history of the Revolutionary War, not published, handwritten, that kept in the family, and people passed it down from generation to generation, and nobody really looked at it. And about 20 or 25 years ago, some distant descendant actually read this and thought that the information about the capture of Nathan Hale might be of interest to people, and donated it to the Smithsonian Institute. And that's how we know this story, but historians and today accept it as absolutely true. So Rogers, done with Nathan Hale, is now a leader of the Queens Rangers. He follows Howe into Westchester County. He has a single major battle in which Continental Army forces stage a surprise attack against the Queens Rangers camp. The Queens Rangers fight it off, but they suffer very extensive losses. And not very long after this, the British Army decides that they're really not very happy with Rogers as a military leader, and they force him to resign. The complaint is that the Queens Rangers are undisciplined, that the officers are inappropriate, the troops are inappropriate, and they're just not an effective fighting force. They later became an effective fighting force under new leadership, and this image of a Queens Ranger from 1780 shows that they, by the end of the Revolutionary War, they were one of the better loyalist regiments, but not under Rogers' tenure. So Rogers is released from his command and reassigned to do recruiting, which he hates. And that'll be the next slide. He does on and off recruiting in the lower colonies in 1777. He's not very good at it, and he obviously is not interested in doing it. He comes up with a proposal to recruit in Canada, where he thinks he'll find more appropriate recruits. The New York British officials say, well, we're not approving it or disapproving it, but we'll let you go to Canada and see if you can persuade the governor there that this is a good idea. Rogers does. The governor is a British officer who knew Rogers from the French and Indian War and didn't think much of him, and he says, no, I don't want you recruiting in my backyard. Rogers then goes to London, again trying to drum up an appointment that would be of interest to him and soliciting letters of recommendation. Gets a couple letters of recommendation, comes back to the United States, to the colonies, and this time persuades the British to definitively let him try to raise a battalion of Rangers from Canada. And he is commissioned to raise a 600-person battalion, which he sets off to Canada to do, trying to recruit in Nova Scotia. He recruits maybe 30 or 40 people of the 600 person battalion, but he is short of funds. So he travels to Quebec to try to persuade the governor there, British governor, to reimburse him for extensive recruiting expenses, which turn out to be mostly bar bills and gambling debts. And the British authorities get pretty annoyed with Rogers. They give him some money to pay off some of these debts, but they send him packing back to Nova Scotia. At that point, they learn that he hasn't recruited anywhere close to 600 people. It's only 30 or 40. And the British authorities in Quebec explode in anger and complain to Rogers' older brother James, who is also a loyalist, also living in Canada at the time, also trying to serve on the British side during the war. And James writes a written apology for his brother's intemperance, explaining to the British authorities that he has told Rogers repeatedly that he needs to lay off the alcohol, or else he's not going to be able to get his act together. But Rogers apparently won't listen to the advice. Rogers is back in Nova Scotia. Within about 6 months, he gets arrested again for failing to pay his debts and thrown into prison in Nova Scotia. He's bailed out only when James comes to his rescue and agrees to make good on the debts that Rogers has run up in Nova Scotia. But after that incident, James has had it with his brother and refuses to speak to him ever again. Just a little history of the relationship between the two brothers. James was Robert Rogers' older brother, but served as a subordinate during the French and Indian War, and was always in Rogers' shadow. But he bailed Rogers out during Rogers' run-up of his $3 million worth of debt in the early 1760s, at one point agreeing to advance Rogers about $600,000 to pay some of the debts, obviously intended as a short-term loan. Rogers never repaid him. James actually sued his brother in 1770, but was unsuccessful in collecting the debt. And this event in 1780 in Nova Scotia was the end of the road as far as James was concerned. So he would have nothing further to do with him. Rogers then decides to go back to New York, but his ship is immediately captured by an American privateer in early 1781. So he is a prisoner of the Continental Army for about 6 or 8 months until he's released in a prisoner exchange just before Yorktown. And after that, he goes back to London. Back in London, and this is the end of the sad story, Rogers lives for another 14 years or so. He died in 1795, having gotten back to London in 1781. He does absolutely nothing that is newsworthy. He basically is in and out of debtor's prison and spends a lot of time in bars. Not destitute, not a vagrant, because he continues to get a retired officer's half pay from the British Army, which is the equivalent of about $50,000 in today's money, but at a time when there were no income taxes. So not enough to live richly, but enough to, survive if you live within your means. Rogers did not. He was completely estranged from his friends and family in the United States. As I've said, his brother cut off all ties with him in 1780, early 1781. His wife divorced him in 1778, and his marriage is its own really fascinating story. And he basically just hung around, not really drawing any attention to himself in London. When he died in 1795, nobody in the United States had any idea that he died or where or under what circumstances. And it wasn't until the 20th century that people actually learned about his final years in London. So that's the end of the story. It's a sort of sad story of somebody who was a really talented person and advanced very far, very rapidly during the French and Indian War, but then had a very long and steep decline. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
How did you become interested in writing this story?
I grew up, I was born in 1950, and I grew up at the height of the Davy Crockett, Walt Disney phase of American culture, where everybody was interested in pioneers and Indian fighters and stuff like that. And Rogers was somebody who I became acquainted with from being a little kid, really, like 10 years old or something like that. There was a famous movie made about Robert Rogers called Northwest Passage, starring Spencer Tracy. I think it was made in 1949, but it kept recirculating during the 50s. And I remember watching that, and there was a TV show about Robert Rogers. So he was somebody I was familiar with, and as a kid thought was, here's a real American hero from the colonial era. As I got older, I started to digest the fact that there was another side to Rogers that was not so flattering. And after I retired and started thinking about, I thought I would like to write books and have them be about history and about areas that I knew something about. And it occurred to me that there was a real story to tell about Robert Rogers. How did somebody of such talent and achievement early in life have such a complete collapse? And that's really what drew me to the subject. Yes?
You know, I look at Robert Rogers and I picture him as being somebody in Instagram, Facebook, social media day. He would have been great at it.
Yes, exactly.
Self-promoting.
Yes.
And to what extent was he unique or not unique among British officers of the day, using their ability to tell their own story in very flattering terms to advance their careers?
Look, this is part of human history generally, and it's not new, and it's never going to go away.
But he's like the famous one, you know?
But he was good at it.
Yeah.
He was really good at it. He knew, if you read, one of the things he did when he went to London in 1765 to lobby, to sell his story, was he published his journals from the French and Indian War. And his journals from the French and Indian War are completely self-effacing. He's constantly talking about his loyalty to the king and the support that he got from his loyal officers and loyal troops, and they deserve all the praise. But in the course of this, he's putting out a completely false narrative about what actually happened that is all to his credit. So he really deftly comes across as somebody who has made enormous achievements based on false information that he provides, but is not bragging about them because he reports it in such a quiet, straightforward way. I think he was really very good at it. He obviously was a terrific conversationalist, and he obviously had the ability to persuade any number of highly placed British aristocrats with his talent and ingenuity and ambition and everything like that, and really talked. I mean, there's a whole story about his interest in finding the Northwest Passage, which is the mythical sea route from the North Atlantic to the North Pacific. He had any number of supporters who were willing to have him appointed to lead such an expedition and appropriate, millions of dollars in order to do it. Never came off for a variety of reasons, including the Revolutionary War, which killed the last attempt to do it. But he was good at making presentations like that. But I think a lot of other people are too, and pretty much everybody, if you ask them their version of what happened in whatever you're interested in, their version is going to put them in a pretty favorable light.
But it seems he used the print media of the day,
Yes.
the way people use influencers use
I think
social
that's
media
right.
today.
I think he was an early person to recognize just how important print media was, because it was just coming into its own in the colonies. The colonies had a much higher literacy rate than most countries in Europe, including England. And so there really were an enormous number of publications being done in the Northeast. And Rogers was great at getting people to send in reports, not under Rogers' name, about things that he'd done, or sitting for interviews, or writing letters to people that were obviously written for publication, and then seeing that they made their way to a newspaper.
Yeah, he understood what content was.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
he was
exactly.
When and where was he born?
He was born in Massachusetts, outside at the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1731. And shortly after his birth, his family moved further into what is now New Hampshire, although was then still a part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, but it became New Hampshire in 1740 something, 1750 something. But basically southern New Hampshire, about 15 miles southwest of present-day Concord. His wife was from Portsmouth, which is between Concord and Boston, further east from where Rogers was.
Thank you.
Do you think Rogers' life would have ended the same way if he ended up fighting for the Patriot cause?
Yes, I think by the time he came back to America, he was washed up.
Alcohol.
Yeah, alcohol, and he had a personality that played great to people who didn't know him and to the press, but did not play so well to people who had to work with him. And when he came back to the colonies in 1775, he really didn't have a lot of friends in high places in the colonies, because other people who fought with him during the French and Indian War had gone on to promotions of their own and positions of authority, which Rogers never got because the military authorities were never impressed with his military record. So I don't think he would have been particularly effective as, Rogers was a terrific deep woods scout and small-time guerrilla fighter. But he was too, in my judgment, too impulsive and too cocksure of himself to be a really effective military leader on a broader scale. And so I don't think he would have been particularly effective on the Patriot side either.
I live on the banks of Putnam Creek,
Mhm.
across from where Putnam was supposedly held by the,
Oh, right, the Battle of Fort Anne.
yeah. And it sounded like the Battle of Fort Anne was totally, Rogers instigated it.
Yes, yes.
Without knowing that he had any.
Right, the Battle of Fort Anne was one, not as famous as the raid on St. Francis, but was a battle in which French and Indian forces ambushed a large British and colonial force, and Israel Putnam, who went on to become a Revolutionary War hero, was captured and nearly killed by the Indians, although he was eventually exchanged in a prisoner exchange and released. But the cause of the ambush was the British and colonial forces were on a long extended scout, and they couldn't find any French and Indians to fight, and they thought that they were in a remote area and there was nobody around. And Rogers suggested a shooting contest, either suggested or agreed to participate in a shooting contest, target shooting, with a couple of, prominent British officers who thought they were pretty good shots and probably every bit as good as Rogers. And so these guys are banging away in the middle of the woods, and unbeknownst to them, there's a large French and Indian force within earshot that knows these guys are now gonna come tramping down the road, and they set up an ambush. And Putnam was leading the tramping back to Fort William Henry and was captured, and it was a long battle, basically fought. It was sort of a British and colonial victory because they drove off the French and Indian force, but not really much credit to anybody. Thank you all.
I know, of course, did he have any kids, any family?
Pardon?
Did he have family, any children?
It's another interesting story. His marriage was a disaster. And by the time it was over, his wife, for good reason, couldn't stand him. But that's a whole nother story. The only time Rogers and his wife spent any time together was during the time that he commanded at Fort Michilimackinac, which was a period of about 2 years. And she accompanied him out there and had a miserable time of it. But she became pregnant at the end of the time that the two of them were at Michilimackinac. The issue was, at the time she presumably became pregnant, if you figure back from the birth date of the child, it was smack in the middle of the time that Rogers was in irons in solitary confinement and prohibited from seeing anybody, including his wife. And that period of time extends for like a month and a half on either side of what would be the period of time where she conceived. And meanwhile, an officer in the fort, for no reason other than just recording what was going on at the fort, recorded that it was widely believed that Rogers' wife was having an affair with another British officer. So there's a pretty compelling case to be made that the child was not Roger's. Rogers never disavowed the child, but he never showed any interest in the child, but he never showed any interest in his wife either. So that part doesn't necessarily prove anything. But I don't think the child was Roger's.
Makes sense.
Anybody else? On behalf of the Friends of Crown Point and the Crown Point Historic Site, we appreciate you making the trip up today. Your presentation was absolutely riveting, absolutely loved it. And we just wanted to present you, I think you might like this book of maps
Oh, fabulous.
dating back to the 1700s.
Thank you so much.
And here's a Friends of Crown Point pin.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Also,
Is this the
the-
map?
Yep.
Great.
Also, if anybody wants Martin to autograph the book, please feel free to come up. And we'll be doing a guided tour outside soon after.
Mhm.
You guys are all free to join.
Great.
Thanks again.
Thank you.